I have problems with affirmative action on two levels. I sort of have a fundamental philosophical disagreement with it in that America has an ideal that we want to move towards a colorblind society. Martin Luther King himself said in his I Have a Dream speech that he envisions an America where people are judged by the character of their content and not the color of their skin. And affirmative action sort of flouts that ideal and says that race does matter, that we're going to hold certain races to one standard and other races to another. And I think that that's sort of a cynical and disappointing approach that says to America, we can't move to something better. We can't move toward that ideal of a colorblind society. So I have a basic philosophical problem with affirmative action on that basis. I also think that it has some practical problems. Ray talked about some of those. It doesn't really accomplish what people say it's there for. There's three sort of justifications for affirmative action. The first one is, that it addresses past wrongs, and that, over time, discrimination has become institutionalized and systematic, and that, in order to overcome that ingrained discrimination, we need a program like affirmative action. But I think in this day and age, when an African American president has been voted into office not once but twice, that it's hard to argue that the sort of default position for the majority of Americans, or even institutions and systematic discrimination, is not to that is not to be discriminatory. I think we've become a more tolerant and more colorblind society, which is wonderful. So I don't think you can make that argument that affirmative action is still needed for that reason. Not that there's no discrimination in America. There probably always will be. There are people who are just going to be discriminatory, and that's unfortunate. But I think for the majority of Americans, and certainly from a systematic perspective, that's not the default position. So I think it's not needed for that reason. The second sort of justification that people use is saying it's going to level the playing field for students who are at a disadvantage, who are attending primary and secondary schools where the books are outdated, where the physical plant is deteriorating, where there's not enough spending per capita, perhaps the teachers aren't up to par, and so these students can't really compete with other schools. 20 minutes away from here is Montgomery County, with some of the top schools in the country, great technology, the highest test scores in the nation. But to say that an African American or Latino student from a school in Montgomery County needs that same sort of extra advantage getting into college as does maybe a child of Vietnamese immigrants and living in poverty and going to a school that has none of the sort of advantages of someone in a richer area is sort of ridiculous to me. So if you're looking to level the playing field, it shouldn't be based on race at all. It should be focused on regions or economic centers. We do a good job in America of tracking schools and their progress and how they're performing, what they spend on students, and we know which schools are failing and which counties do better than others. And if you want to level the playing field for people, focus on those regions and economic factors rather than race as sort of that determination for who needs assistance. So I think affirmative action fails on that level. And the last sort of argument is this promotion of diversity on campus. And I agree with Stephen that absolutely the life's blood of an academic community is having different perspectives, letting disagreement create new ideas and challenge people's conceptions about what life is about and what's real, what's true, and that's necessary on college campuses. But if diversity is the real goal, then it shouldn't simply be about race. There are students of different religions that are underrepresented. There's students who are underrepresented who have different gender identities. I happen to be part of America's largest minority group, the disabled. There are 54 million disabled people in America. It's larger than the number of African Americans in the country, larger than the number of Latinos, and yet by several percentage points, we make up fewer students or are represented less than than African Americans or Latinos in college campuses, and the numbers for graduate school are even worse. But affirmative action doesn't apply to anyone with a disability, and I'd venture to say that people with disabilities face as many challenges and possibly as much discrimination as any other minority group, and yet we're completely ignored by affirmative action. I'm not, however, arguing that affirmative action should apply to us. I sort of reject the idea of holding different people to different standards as a sort of fundamental philosophical difference. But I think that affirmative action fails to accomplish what its proponents say it does, and that it actually causes more divisiveness and resentment between students, and it sets people of one race against another, and so it does more harm than good. It's sort of another example of the road to hell being paved with good intentions. Some students think, correctly or incorrectly, that they didn't get into their school of first choice because someone, quote unquote, took their spot who had lesser credentials. There are other students who got into school who were eligible for affirmative action, but got in solely because they had superior academic qualifications. But they might have that stigma that other people might think, well, this person just got in because of affirmative action, when it isn't the case, and they're stigmatized by it. That's not the case for everyone, but it could be. And then there are students who did get in on affirmative action who might feel that they're unsure if they can compete with other students who did so much better than them in primary and secondary schools, and might feel inferior. I'm not saying that they are, but that might be a worry of theirs. And I think that it creates divisiveness, and it creates resentment, and it inhibits the free flow of ideas. And I think that's why you don't see a lot of discussion in public on campuses, because people don't want to offend one another. It's sort of an underlying irritation, and people might talk about it with their friends in private, but nobody wants to offend other people. And I think on the whole, most college students are quite tolerant, quite open, and it's more a concern of, I don't want to appear intolerant, I don't want to offend people, even though I have some philosophical differences about the helpfulness of affirmative action.